Good morning, Ed. Oh, morning.
Good evening.
Afternoon. Afternoon in your case. I'm sorry. It's 6 p.m. in your place, isn't it?
Just 5 p.m., so
5
not
p.m.
not too bad.
Is it okay if I call you by your first name, by the way?
Yeah, please,
All
please.
right. All right. Call me Timon. That's the way to pronounce my first name, Timon.
Thank you, Timon. I was going to ask.
Yeah. So you're really punctual. 9 exactly. Well done. Well done. Um, well, let me introduce myself to you first, so you know who you are talking to. I'm a teacher of English and music on the secondary school in Holland. Um, and apart from teaching, I interview as well. And it's my mission to bridge the huge gaps between education, science, and the rest of the world. And I'm talking to you today because um, it's also my mission to raise critical citizens, critical students who know how to assess information. And exactly that is becoming a bigger problem in the Netherlands. I noticed through the years that my students are less and less capable of assessing information um, to see if it's valid or true or real. And you have written a book called Facts and Other Lies. I can see it in the background. I have a digital copy, so I can't show it to my readers and viewers. But we are going to talk about your book and about its implications for education. I would like to know from you how we can use education as a vehicle, as a tool to educate students to become, well, critical citizens who know how to assess information on its validity, so to say. So you are the author of the book and you are the executive director of the Center for Impact Communications. What does the center do exactly?
Well, my background is not in education, and I salute everyone who is a teacher. My wife is a teacher, and she comes from a long line of teachers. So, thank you for every teacher out there and everyone who's listening. My background is in social impact and change making and advocacy. So, working on issues that need some kind of policy change or behavior change, and working out how to do that. And working on that over the years, I realized that the best way to create change was actually to have great stories and great storytelling. And so the Center for Impact Communications works with those people who are trying to make the world a better place on whatever issue they're working on, and works with them to help build their skills and tell better stories and get those stories out there in a way that creates impact. And so if you've got a really important issue out there, most people who work on them normally think about the facts and the figures. This is really important because here's a lot of statistics. But in fact, if you don't put a good story around it and have a good narrative to tell, then people's brains just don't really listen to things that are facts and figures. They listen to stories, and that's what the Center for Impact Communications helps people do.
And one of your customers is the Australian government, I think. Am I correct?
No, we have some political clients
Oh.
who are trying to do that. So we work on some election campaigns,
Mhm.
but the Australian government's not a client of ours.
All right. No, it's important to know that you are not the government. You
No,
are independent of the government. You have done some political campaigns, but you are certainly not the government. All right.
that's
So
right.
what else can you tell about your background? For example, what did you study?
Well, I studied a couple of different things. I have a couple of degrees. One is what we call in Australia an arts degree, but that's not art. That's more the liberal arts, the
Yeah.
humanities, most people call them. And my major there was in history and modern history. But I also did a law degree, although I had no intention of becoming a lawyer. I thought it was a pretty good general degree in critical thinking and being able to understand how systems work around us and how to deal with systems from a legal point of view. And I think that increasingly these days, a lot more people are learning law degrees as a general degree, not just like a practitioner training in a specific career in a specific skill set. I think sometimes I hear statistics that maybe even more than half of people who do a degree in law don't go on to become a lawyer and practice in the courtroom or in a private law firm. And I do think it was a very good general education and that taught me good skills.
Talking about education, if you think back, if you go back to your own secondary school education, maybe um, um, prior to your secondary education, primary school, well, how would you describe Australian education? I don't really know a lot about Australian education. I've interviewed a professor called John Hattie once about Australian education. Maybe you know him, he's from Melbourne University, but I'm not really familiar. What what are the main aspects of Australian education?
Well, I think Australian education system is a fairly good education system. It's definitely not as good as it should be. And in fact, over time, we have all these standards and measurements. I'm sure you know a lot more about this than I do, but there's a question of, is this a good way to measure, an education system just by students' numeracy and literacy skills? That's a very superficial measurement. I think that in most rankings, Australia does okay in terms of our numeracy and literacy, but could do much better. But overall, it's a very good education system. There's I think one of the big problems with our education system is that you have your public education system, then you have your elite private school education system. But a lot of students actually are taught in Australia with something in between, which is independent schools, which are private, but they get a lot of government funding, but they're not part of the public education system. And most of those schools are Catholic education system. But it's not majority Catholic students. It's Australians who want to pay a little bit for their kids' education, so they send them to these schools that are kind of in between a private and an elite private school and a public school. But even the elite public schools get government funding as well.
Really?
So there's always this tension between the public education system, which never has enough money, like all public education systems, but elite private schools who might have, very good facilities and swimming pools and, all the other finer things that the public schools don't have, but they still get public money. So this is always the conversation in Australian education is why are these private schools getting money versus the public schools not having enough money? And usually the government's response is that we want to support every student, regardless of what type of school they're in. Most of the funding is based on needs, so the public schools get the majority of the funding, but everyone gets some funding. So I think overall the Australian education system is good, but it has a lot of inequalities which should be addressed. And like everywhere, it needs more money.
Yeah, I don't think there is an equal education system where everybody is equal or treated equal. It doesn't happen. I don't know of one. Well, Australia is not really a topic in the Dutch news. It's everything. We are focused on America. So every day, America is a news item. So here in the Netherlands, we don't really know what's happening in Australia. One thing that I remembered was all those. Well, there was one particular clip from a quarantine camp where people had to go in quarantine, and it was really terrible, and was almost like all of Australia was turned in one big quarantine camp. But that's, of course, not how reality is in Australia right now. So, how is Australia doing now at this moment?
Australia's doing okay. I think we're where a lot of other countries are, which is we've accepted that that COVID is everywhere, and have wound back a lot of the restrictions that that we used to have. So Australia's journey through the pandemic is a little bit different from most countries, mostly because we're an island, and
Mm-hmm.
that comes with some advantages. So so very early on in the pandemic, Australia closed its borders and made it very hard to get in. And then probably the story that you're referencing is that if people wanted to come in, they had to spend 2 weeks in
Yes.
quarantine on their way in. So, you know, a lot of people saw that as harsh, but the benefit of that was throughout most of 2020, we lived without any coronavirus at all. And so life in Australia, when other countries in Europe and America and elsewhere were living under severe lockdowns, life was continuing as usual for Australia. And then, of course, we had other periods where there were long lockdowns once COVID came in. But on the whole, we were able to put those off until after a lot of the population had been vaccinated. So the levels of death and severe disease is definitely lower in Australia than it was in other countries. So our journey has been very different for most of the world over the last couple of years. And where we are now is, I think it's human nature could only bear so much bad news
Mm-hmm.
and focus on one issue. So I think a lot of people are not thinking about it at all, which doesn't mean people are not still dying and
Yeah,
getting sick.
yeah.
I think people have just reached a point where they couldn't think about it any longer, and so they live in a bit of denial.
A couple of months ago, I talked to futurist Kevin Kelly, and I asked him, you know, could you mention one thing that's going well in America that we don't know about in the Netherlands? And he said, well, more and more people are buying electric cars and getting rid of their fossil fuel cars. So if you had to mention one positive aspect of Australian society that's going on as we speak, what would it be?
Um, well, one good thing about Australia that has changed recently is probably on a similar issue. Australia digs up a lot of the coal and gas
Mm.
that is exported around the world, and so as a result, we've always been a little bit behind the curve in terms of our attitudes to climate change. Um, and that really infected our political system as well, and the fossil fuel companies are very powerful in Australia, and it wasn't really possible to have a genuine political debate about that because we have a two-party system, and so there wasn't much room for debate. But we just had an election in May this year, so just a few months ago, and it was very notable because we kind of moved a little bit past the two-party system. And a lot of people voted for independent candidates who weren't part of a political party. And without going into too much detail, we have preferential voting and compulsory voting. And so it makes it very hard for anyone other than the two major parties to get elected. But a number of these independents who really represented the values of their constituents, specifically people who cared a lot about climate change and were very unhappy with Australia's lack of action on climate change. And enough of them won to really make a difference. And that changed the conversation for everyone and for the major parties about climate change, where now we can be like most of the rest of the world, where we can kind of move past climate denial and
Mhm.
have a much more productive conversation about, well, we agree this is happening. Let's talk about the different solutions. Maybe this is a good option. maybe we should transition out of this energy, maybe we should create some economic opportunity around here, and that's really because we defied some political convention and had a very good result.
So that's a positive development now in Australia. Let's talk about facts and other lies. When did you come up with that book title, by the way?
Well, as I was writing it, I had about 100 different titles in my head, and some of them were better than others. And one of the problems I had was I try to cover a lot of ground in the book, a lot of different topics, and it's really hard to capture that in a really brief title, which should only be a few words. And so, I kind of had this idea in the back of my head, and as many other titles that I could come up with, nothing really captured the issue as well as this one. And luckily the publisher agreed, and they sometimes have their own opinions about the title and disagree with the author, but luckily they thought this was a great title as well. So I was lucky. And then the subtitle, which I think is important, is Welcome to the Disinformation Age, which is one of the key themes of the book, is that we have moved from one age into a new age. And the old age we've been leaving behind was the information age, with computers and access to, this great volume of information. And the theme of the book is we've moved into a new age. So I'm calling that the Disinformation Age.
Yeah. So when did you start writing the book, and what made you decide to write a book in the first place?
Really, I kind of decided to write this book because I was very surprised that I couldn't find a book like this out there already. And I was doing a lot of work. All of my career, I've kind of been looking at ways to use the internet and social media and new technologies in order to, get information out to people and motivate them to act on that information. And I noticed over the last few years that task had become very difficult and very different. Something had changed. And then, after a few, notable global events like the Russian government trying to interfere in the US 2016 election, and, these sorts of ideas became more current, and people started developing terminology around, the misuse of information on the internet by calling it fake news or misinformation or disinformation. And my job in my career is to really help people navigate these sorts of changes. And so I went looking for a resource that could tell me what was happening and why it was happening and what I should do about it. And I couldn't find anything. I could find a lot of really good academic research in journals, which was scientific studies that empirically tried to answer little bits and pieces of this puzzle. And I could find people who worked on certain areas of this writing really good resources. So journalists work on this a lot, and there was some good resources for journalists. And cognitive scientists study this a lot, and there's some good resources for them. And little bits and pieces, but there was nothing that was a really general overview of what this topic is all about. How has information changed, and the way we get our information changed, and how do people manipulate that? And then the other thing is, all of that research that you do find says that the more you can explain to people about this topic and educate them about how it works, that's actually one of our best defenses against people getting fooled by misinformation and disinformation. So I'd done little bits and pieces on some themes in the book, but I thought, well, if this doesn't exist, then I've probably got enough information here to pull it together myself and write it and create my own resource around the topic.
Talk about the writing process. How do you write a book? Because it's different for everybody I talk to. What was
it's
your
different for everybody? I like to write it in one big chunk. You know, some people can dip in and out of it over the course of a year or months or something. And my publisher said to me about 6 weeks from when my deadline was, you know, how much have you written? And the answer was not very much. And she said, why don't we push the deadline out more? And I said, you know what, if you do that, I'm just going to be in exactly the same spot 6 weeks out from the new deadline. So I prefer to just kind of really, you know, really put my head down and write and do it in focused on something really intensely for a short period rather than trying to think about it, you know, a little bit at a time over a long period. And the other thing that's probably a little bit strange compared to how most people like to write is I found it much more easy to concentrate if I went to a noisy public place than to sit in a quiet place, you know, at home. And so I would take my laptop to cafes or bars or pubs and sit in those and
Really?
write.
Wow.
Kind of maybe something about the white noise or I don't know what it is exactly, but I found that to be more productive than, you know, sitting in a quiet place. And then it was just a matter of there's a lot of research in the book, a lot of different sources, and I think that one of the tricks is you could spend too long, you know, researching and never writing. So you've got to, when you're doing a lot of research, you've got to force yourself to always be writing. Otherwise you could just research forever and never get to a place where you start writing. And the other tip, which I think a lot of writers give this advice, is you've just got to start writing and not worry about making it perfect. It's much better to just put pen to paper and start writing and then get in the flow. And, you know, the best way to overcome writer's block is to just start writing anything, no matter how bad it is or how wrong it is. You just start writing, and eventually, you know, you kind of get into gear and you'll be able to get through writer's block. So I think it's a good tip that I tried to follow, is just don't worry about what I'm saying, you know, the quality of it too much. Just start writing and get words down on paper. You can edit them later, and your editor can edit them later and make it good later. Let's just start writing.
Yeah. So you divided the book in 6 chapters: the information ecosystem, the disinformation ecosystem, game time, the US elections, psychology, defeating disinformation, which is important for me as a teacher and as a parent, I think, shared reality. Let's go through these chapters, but I think it's important to make that distinction between misinformation, disinformation, and fake news, because they're not really interchangeable, are they? They are different.
No, people use them as if they're interchangeable, but actually, it's very important to draw the distinction. I mean, fake news is a term that I think has pros and cons. The pros of saying fake news is everyone knows what you're talking about. You know, this is a new topic that we don't talk a lot about, and fake news is a new term that everybody seems to use. So it's good to have, you know, common language around it. But the con of using fake news is people use it differently. Some people use fake news to criticize real news, and some people use fake news to criticize fake news. And so you have both sides of an argument accusing each other of fake news. So it's not good from that point of view. And so we need better language than just saying fake news, because everyone hears something different when you say fake news. The other term that a lot of people use is misinformation, and misinformation just means any information that is false or faulty somehow. And sometimes there's actually very legitimate reasons why something might be misinformation. So if you make an honest mistake and later make a correction, that could be seen as misinformation, even though you didn't have a bad motive. Or probably my favorite example is satire, which I love, which I think is a really persuasive form of communication. That's also misinformation, but it's not designed to fool people. It's designed to make a point that is valid by manipulating information in a way. So you can't just think of misinformation as any manipulated information, because sometimes there can be a good reason for it. So what I talk about in the book and what I focus on is disinformation, because the big difference is that is when someone is using false or faulty information deliberately, and they are trying to deceive you for some ulterior motive. They might be doing it for political power or for profit, or to fool you, for some other nefarious purpose. And quite often people will get together in organized networks to create false realities around something, and they're on a mission to spread those false realities, and do so by really weaponizing lying and fooling people and making things up or distorting or manipulating information. So that is disinformation. I think that's the topic that we need to focus on most as a society, because that's the thing that can be so harmful.
Well, let's just start with the information ecosystem. You talk about an ecosystem. One thing I think was in the first chapter, I don't really remember, when people ask Siri or Google about a fact, my students as well, for example, when did the First World War end, and Siri provides us with an answer, we take it for granted that Siri knows the truth. But you tell people in the book that Siri is looking up the answer as well. And
yeah, and Siri might be looking at Wikipedia. And
exactly,
Wikipedia, I think Wikipedia actually does a very good job. It's mostly right, but we don't know if it's right or wrong, because anyone can edit it at any time. And so we treat information from the internet as if it is an infallible source of truth. But in fact, it's not. And so the information ecosystem is really trying to unpack how we receive information, and how we form opinions through that information, and some of the changes that have occurred recently that makes that very difficult. So there's always been, and this is what that section talks about as well, there's always been problems with information, right? We never had some golden age where everybody had the truth. There's always, people always lied, and human beings, a normal part of being human is lying. And then people always tried to manipulate each other's opinions, either through propaganda or other sort of misinformation campaigns. All of those things are new. So what I think we need to understand is that the way we get information now is really problematic. And this is what you're talking about with your students. And we have moved from an era where there were very few news sources and very few information sources. They didn't always get it right, but there was some kind of forces of restraint and quality on them, because there was only a couple of news sources, and we all could get our information from the same places, and then we would disagree about it. We would have our opinions about it. Some person would think one thing, another person would think another, and we could have a debate around that. But we were all largely debating the same facts. First thing that happened was the news media industry collapsed. The business model that it had been built on was based on making a newspaper or a TV channel and collecting news, and everyone would have to come to you and watch that news or read that news. And so you could sell advertising because everyone was watching the news. Now the internet came along and people could get the same kind of classified advertising, like, hi, I'm Ed, I need to sell a mug. I'm going to put an ad in the newspaper and someone will get it. I'll pay the newspaper to place that ad and someone will see it. Of course, we can do that on the internet for free now. And so this really exposed an inconvenient truth for the news industry, which was news doesn't sell, facts don't sell, and people won't pay for them in and of themselves. That's a big problem, because that's how we would generate facts and news and find out information. We would pay a newspaper for advertising. They would use that money to go and hire a journalist. The journalist would go to your parliament and report on what was happening and tell it back to you, and the whole system worked. That didn't work anymore. and so that became a big problem. The other thing that happened, which was a fundamental change to how we get our information, was social media. And we started getting our information from social media platforms that were not news publishers, and they didn't behave like news publisher. A newspaper editor, their job is to look at all of the stories and decide this is an important one for you to know. A social media platform's job is to look at all the information out there and think this is something you would agree with, and they show you the thing that you all agree with, or this is something that I know is going to really provoke an emotional reaction in you, and they show you something that will make you angry or sad or afraid or happy, or maybe on the good end of that spectrum would be, I'm going to show you some cute pictures of kittens and puppies, and I get a great, dopamine rush and I'm happy. But on the bad end of it, they might show someone something that says, immigrants are stealing your job, and that makes you really angry. So the platform doesn't distinguish between good information like cute puppies and harmful information like something racist against immigrants. It just is deciding what's going to get a reaction out of you. And so there's no filter for what information it shows you. So this was a really big problem. And this combined with the internet really disrupting how information is out there, and then social media platforms deciding what information we should see. This is why we need to teach students the skills of how to navigate this ecosystem, because it's fundamentally broken down.
Yeah, you talk about rabbit holes and about bubbles, and how when do you realize as a student that you are in fact in a rabbit hole or information bubble? It's really hard to decide for yourself. It's almost as if someone else has to tell you.
It's very hard. It's very hard to decide for yourself, because the problem with rabbit holes and bubbles, and so just to kind of clarify what we're talking about, a bubble is where you find yourself in a situation where you only see one side of the story and one type of information, and you're never exposed to another story. And a rabbit hole is where you kind of piece by piece get taken on a journey where you might start somewhere that's fairly harmless, and then you find yourself getting deeper and deeper in a story or an issue, and it might be a conspiracy theory, and it just leads you down to a place where you're actually viewing quite harmful information, and you might develop quite harmful ideas around something. So the problem is, as you ask, you don't realize you're in that, is because when you're in those, you're only surrounded by other people who think the same way. And this is just a problem for, in all things. A diversity of opinion is healthy. And when you are only surrounded by people who think the same as you lose perspective, and you think that what your group thinks is right, regardless of how wrong it is, regardless of how harmful it might be, because you're only exposed to other people. And the other problem with that is, when you're in a group who thinks the same as each other, you become very hostile to people who think differently, and hostile to ideas that are contrary to how you think. And this is what we've seen a really big increase in globally in the last couple of years, as you face big disruptions that upset the normal way of things. It forces people into these bubbles much more easily. And so regardless of what your bubble is and what your bubble thinks, they become hostile. And if you want to reach someone in one of those bubbles and correct their thinking, if they're wrong about something, or if they live in some false reality, it's really hard to do, because whatever information is contrary to their reality is treated very as if it's hostile information, and they become hostile to you and to the information you're trying to get. And we've seen this. Every family has experienced this in the last couple of years, as opinions have diverged around the pandemic and lockdowns and the vaccine, etc., where a lot of families are getting cut off from each other.
I personally I'm trying to find out more about the conflict in Russia. Why are what's the viewpoint of the Russians? And last month I interviewed Pulitzer Prize winner Chris Hedges. I don't know if you know his name. He was a correspondent for CNN for a long time, and he wrote a lot of articles for Russia Today, but they were all taken offline. So talking about information bubbles, how are we ever to know the viewpoint of the Russians? What kind of information are they fed? And there's a good reason why many people in Russia believe the Russian narrative. So it
Well,
also.
yeah, Russia's a really good example because they invented a lot of the techniques
Hmm.
of disinformation during the Cold War. They're very good at disinformation, and the problem with that is it becomes so hard to trust a lot of the information that comes out of Russia because
Hmm.
they use it as a weapon, and they use false information as a weapon. It's very hard to recognize true information when it comes out of Russia, and Russia Today is a good example of that. That's a platform that was set up to further a political aim. So there might be information that came out of Russia Today. Sometimes it would be true, and sometimes it would be propaganda. But because there's propaganda, because Russia weaponizes information, then it makes it very hard to tell the difference between the two. And so Russia really became expert in disinformation during the Cold War, when disinformation was very expensive and difficult and time consuming to make. When the internet came along, disinformation became very cheap and easy and quick to make.
Mhm.
And so we've seen an explosion in the types of techniques that used to be limited to state actors like Russia. Now anyone can do them at scale. And so, disinformation has been democratized where anyone can do it. And again, that erodes people's trust in any information, regardless of where it's coming from. So when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, and then again in this year, I think people were expecting a lot of disinformation, and people have their different views on which side is spreading disinformation. But the overall effect meant that people have a very little level of trust in any information around the war, because there's so much misinformation and disinformation floating around it. And this is a big problem. To bring this back to thinking about students and education and how to deal with this, I think this is one of the big problems that we're facing for especially younger generations, is when you grow up in a world full of disinformation, the problem becomes not whether or not you will be fooled by disinformation. The problem becomes, will you believe any information? Will you trust any information? And how do you inhabit a world where you are not sure what information to trust? That's the real problem that all of this causes.
Yeah, so we have come to chapter 2. We've talked about the disinformation ecosystem already. So, sorry, social media is a big contributor to disinformation. What other channels do we have when it comes
Well,
to?
social media gets a lot of the attention, and that's quite right, because as I explained before, there's another problem with social media, which is it chooses which information you digest. Mostly in other things, we choose what information we digest. So
In the book
social
you
media is a big.
in the book you
Yeah.
refer to Mark Zuckerberg, who admits that there is an information hierarchy on social media. First, the information that sells and draws attention, and then the real information, so to say.
Yeah, and Facebook, look, I think people should remember that Facebook is at the end of the day an advertising platform.
Mm.
It is built to learn a lot about its users and then sell that information to people who want to advertise to its users. So that's okay. Facebook's entitled to do that. And but the problem with that is when you build an advertising platform and then expect it to replace the news media as the place where we get our information and our facts from, those two things are in complete conflict with each other. it's not supposed to be a platform where we get our information from. It's supposed to be a platform we get our advertising from. So that's the big problem with social media, and a lot of these problems, like Facebook is they've shown, they have whistleblowers that have exposed the fact that they know Facebook is radicalizing people. They know Facebook is not doing a good job of removing disinformation from its platform. But that's because it was not supposed to be serving that role in the first place. That's an unintended consequence of what it's actually built to do. So, so social media is a big part of it. The other kind of key feature of social media is that it's very easy to exploit, because people can create fake accounts at scale and then have them all say the same thing. So it looks to people like there is a big, widespread opinion on a topic that might not be true. So Twitter is a good example where they've faced a lot of campaigns with Twitter bots that are not real, and they can get a topic trending. They can get a hashtag trending. And so if you are trying to have your opinion in the world when you feel strongly about an issue, what you used to have to do is convince a lot of other people to share your opinion, and then share that opinion with others. You can just bypass that now by creating fake people that have your opinion all saying it. So that's the other problem that social media gets weaponized for. One of the other things that is part of the disinformation ecosystem is the fact that we still trust news websites to get our information, but we're not very good at telling the difference between a real news site and a fake news website. So, this is not about, partisan propaganda networks like Fox News in America. This is about people just starting a website that looks like a news website, and they can write whatever the hell they want. But if it looks like an article, as humans, we're just predisposed to trust that information because we are in the habit of trusting newspaper articles. So it makes it very easy to just create your own newspaper article, and that's a really effective way of creating a fake reality as well. And the other element that I think it's important to note is that we like forming groups, and we've done this face-to-face in society since human evolution. We form tribes, we form family units, we form sporting teams and clubs around following our favorite sporting team. This is just a normal piece of human behavior. But now on these platforms, you can form groups as well, and they become very effective places to share information. And so I might be part of a Facebook group around an idea, and someone can put information into that group, and we all see it, and we all engage with it, and we all share it. So that can be a really healthy thing in the right case, but that can also be a really effective weapon of disinformation as well. Because if I have a conspiracy theory that I'm trying to push, or if I'm trying to undermine a political opponent and I want to get an idea in there, then we can form a group that makes that idea spread really quickly and really effectively and spreads really far. That's what social media and the internet is built for, to spread ideas really quickly. So that can be a good thing, but that can be a bad thing as well.
Yeah, you talk about in India, some cases of people reading messages on social media about assumed pedophiles, and those people were killed without any evidence. So it's really easy indeed to form groups, and groups are really prone to believing whatever they read.
This is a really good example of how it can be really harmful. And another one recently was the example of Iran. When COVID hit, people started spreading this false idea that if you drink ethanol, then it will cure COVID. And of course, drinking ethanol is very harmful and potentially fatal. And so this idea was spread through messaging apps, like WhatsApp and or Telegram and on social media. And a lot of people died because they saw this information and they drank ethanol and it killed them. And so social media at its best allows us to spread good ideas. And so a lot of the elements of that example in Iran would have been really positive if someone was spreading a beneficial health information. And it would have been much more effective than, say, 100 years ago, when you're trying to get people to practice good public health practice, and you're trying to get that idea around. That was very hard. In 2022, it's very easy to spread that idea. But you see in the example of Iran that when it is a harmful idea, that becomes a very problematic thing, because the authorities in Iran could not reach the people as quickly and as widely to tell them, don't drink ethanol, it will kill you, as this idea was already, because people shared it amongst their groups, their families, their social networks, etc.
Well, that tells me a bit about their basic education. I mean, if you had just a tiny bit of chemistry in school, or biology or whatever, this would not have happened. So it's not only social media; it's also a really poor education system, a lack of education in general, I think. And of course,
And people are they don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about something. Human society is built on the idea that we can trust each other, and we can trust the information that we pass along to each other. And we know as humans that sometimes we're going to be lied to, but lies would not be effective unless we were mostly truthful. If we were predisposed to assume every time that you tell me something you're lying, I'm never going to fall for a lie. But I'm predisposed to assume whatever you're telling me is true. So we don't do a very good job of doing exactly what you're saying, of saying, hang on, let me take this information and think, how does this stack up against my high school science exam? Do I know the chemistry behind this? Am I going to think about whether or not this is a good idea or a bad idea? We're just not very good at taking the time to go through that process. We're much more likely to just say, okay, great idea, bring on the ethanol, I'm going to drink the ethanol, and never think about it.
and yet I think the amount of casualties would have been lower in Australia than in Iraq because of education.
Yeah, I think you're right, because we definitely had a lot of similar conspiracy theories traveling around Australia as well. I'm sure you did in the Netherlands, where everyone had their own magic cure, and some of it, like drinking bleach, which is very harmful, or taking, this horse dewormer, is very harmful. And those sorts of conspiracy theories didn't really travel very far and wide in Australia, because I think we had enough base level of education to know that that didn't sound right. And we also have a very high level of trust in government in Australia. And so when you have a government telling you to follow a public health advice, I think Australians are more likely to follow that advice than many other countries, especially the US. We're much more likely to follow government advice here culturally. So I think that was one of the differences as well.
Before I go to my next questions, we've been talking for 15 minutes. So I would like to ask you, how much time do you have, Ed?
Oh, yeah, we can go till 1:30 if that's all right with you.
Great.
Yeah,
Great. Half past. I have to leave at 1:30 as well. You mentioned the U.S. elections, talking about government. Talk about the U.S. elections. You say game time, the U.S. elections.
Yeah, the game time was, the previous section talked about all these techniques, and then the game time is you see them in action around the US presidential elections. So it's not like that's the only place that these disinformation campaigns happen. The Americans didn't invent it. This is just, you mentioned at the start of this call that people in the Netherlands follow American news. We do the same in Australia. Australians obsess about what's happening with Trump, and just as much as Americans do. So the American presidential elections was really the time that most people were exposed to a lot of these ideas, when they saw a lot of what happens in disinformation campaigns when they're when they get covered in the media. So we saw a lot of the features that we're talking about. There was foreign interference from Russia, who was creating fake accounts and trying to manipulate public opinion with that. But we also saw a lot of Americans doing this themselves. We saw social media bubbles develop. We saw fake news websites pop up, and we saw people spreading disinformation ideas really effectively on social media and the internet. And then we saw with Trump someone who is a political leader that was happy to take advantage of all these disinformation campaigns. So what happens when a political elite really encourages these campaigns and feeds his supporters with the same kind of narratives that they're finding in conspiracy theory chat rooms and on the internet? And that's a very interesting example, because what you see when that happens is they become much more effective. And plenty of the same types of disinformation campaigns happen in other countries where politicians don't embrace them, and they don't go very far. And in America, you see when a politician embraces those conspiracy theories, they become much more widespread. And this culminates in the 2020 election, where Joe Biden wins the election and Donald Trump loses the election. But because they've built this big architecture around disinformation, they can choose what reality to believe, and they can choose what reality to show to their supporters. And so the Trump campaign chooses a reality where he didn't lose the election and Joe Biden won the election. And because of what had happened over these last few years around people being in bubbles, people being cut off from normal fact-based information and getting their information from social media, that's effective. And today, a very large proportion of America lives in this false reality that Donald Trump won the election and Joe Biden lost the election. And it's very hard to come back from that. It's really just two Americas in parallel now, very divided. They're very hostile to each other, very resistant to any outside thought or any contrary opinion. And how do you solve a problem like that? You normally solve a problem like that through political institutions and trust in those institutions, and they don't have that in America anymore. So America and American elections are really useful examples for the rest of the world to look at, to see what happens when all of these disinformation tools are used really effectively, and what are some of the consequences that you'll see when these are all used together quite effectively.
What makes it difficult for me, because I think I'm well read and I had good education. For me, when I hear a professor talking, it sounds really reliable because I know he's a professor. I think it's called the halo effect. I'm not really sure. But when I see some well-educated professor talking about, for example, there's this professor in America, his name is John Marsheimer, and he talks about the Ukraine conflict, and he says America is to blame for the conflict because when the NATO was established, they promised, I think it was Gorbachev, we're not going to move 1 inch to the east. It's a sentence that keeps coming back to me. Also, Noam Chomsky told me this very same sentence. Actually, Chomsky has the same opinion. So when somebody with the stature of Noam Chomsky says America is to blame, I tend to believe that, and not really the government narrative. You see how difficult it is? If I can't even trust well-read professors, how do you do it?
This is a really good point, because it's all about trust in information. and trust in sources. And so I think a healthy information ecosystem has a couple of things. It has trustworthy people giving information, and it has an audience that can trust the information that they're receiving. Now, one of the kind of mistakes we make when thinking about how to deal with disinformation is there's a couple of things that are perfectly legitimate, and that is differences in opinion and differences in interpretation. So I think that there is a very good argument to be made with valid supporting facts that Russia is to blame for the invasion of Ukraine. I think there is also a valid argument to be made with supporting facts that America is responsible for Russia's actions in invading Ukraine. This is a difference of opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And we should support an environment where you have a professor on one hand giving his valid opinion supported by facts, and you have a professor on the other hand giving her opinion on valid supported facts, and an audience who can listen to both and make a determination about who has the more persuasive arguments. Now, that is a good thing, and that is how society should work. But that is very, very different to how disinformation works. Disinformation works where they will erode your audience's trust in either of these two professors, and they will present things that aren't facts to fool you about the existence of a reality that doesn't exist. So I am 100% comfortable with you living in a world where we have established reality, and you might think Russia's responsible, or you might think America's responsible. I'm happy for you to make your opinion up about that. But where I get worried is where your information is not based on reality, and you have got information that has been weaponized using these techniques to fool you into thinking one thing that is simply not true. And the people who are trying to tell you something that's true have a great deal of difficulty getting through to you, because we don't live in a healthy information ecosystem. And this is, I think, is the important thing for students to be able to do, is to get the skills to make sure we're living in the first version, not the second version. So how does that argument about the Russian invasion of Ukraine play out in the real world? Well, a lot of people are making that determination based on really sophisticated disinformation campaigns that have nothing to do with reality and rely on the erosion of trust that the audience has in the people that are trying to tell them otherwise. The mainstream media, political actors, professors, you name it, the places where we normally get good information from, you undermine trust in those so that it's easier for me to get my false reality to you and to convince you of my opinion, as opposed to just giving you a good argument based on facts.
In chapter 4, you talk about psychology. I think the psychology of disinformation. There's a good reason people lie. Talk about the reasons. You already talked a bit about it, but there is an evolutionary aspect to it as well. Talk about the psychology of disinformation.
This is, you can't talk about disinformation if you don't talk about just how human brains work. And I learned an incredible amount in writing and researching this book about how human brains work, because I'm not a psychologist or a cognitive, behavioralist, or the people who study the way the brain works. And when you look at how the brain works, these disinformation campaigns make perfect sense, because we think that we as human beings are very rational creatures, and we think that we care about the truth, and we think that the truth is important and a really determining factor about how we act and what we'll do and what we'll say. But that is not how our brains work. Our brains do not really care about the truth. We do to some degree. It's not like we don't care at all, but it's the point is we have other motivations that are much stronger, much stronger than whether or not something is true or false. And the kinds of things that are most important to our brains are social. How do I fit in with my peers? What do my peers think? Am I thinking the same as them? Can I quantify how popular this idea is or how unpopular this idea is? These are the sorts of things when, there's a good example that I use in the book. For instance, someone else wrote about when they said, if you're a barber in South Carolina and you care about climate change, or you think climate change is real, there's no incentive for you to tell your customers that climate change is real, because you will lose your customers. And so the brain is always doing this kind of calculation all the time. What's important to me as a barber in South Carolina is what my customers think. So I have an incentive to think the same as them. And if they think something that is false, my brain will readily think the same thing if I think that that's going to improve my social standing with people. So the problem with this is social media platforms have found a way to really take advantage of the way our brains think. And so they connect us to our peers. They quantify how many other people agree with something. There's a like button that says 67 people like this idea. That's really important for our brains to know how many people like this idea. And then they also are good at pulling our emotional triggers. Like I said before, we're not rational. We're largely irrational. We are guided by instinct and emotion rather than our inner scientists who are evaluating facts neutrally. Very little of what our brain does is neutral. So when you see a piece of information, it doesn't have to be on social media, anywhere in the world, you see a piece of information, and we think as rational creatures that we take that information, we evaluate it, and then we form an opinion based on our evaluation. That's not what happens at all. What happens is we see a piece of information and we will twist it to fit what we already think. We will twist it to conform to our worldview. We will twist it to conform to what our peers think, what our friends and family thinks, what I think will be a popular opinion, not a factual opinion or a correct opinion. So none of the ways that our brain works are really favorable to truth and facts and to fighting disinformation. All of the ways our brain work are really favorable to disinformation because it really plays into some of our biases and laziness and social motivations.
You refer to lots and lots of authors. One I really like is Hannah Arendt, and you refer to her a lot. Who is she, and why do you use her as a reference in your book?
Well, Hannah Arendt was a philosopher who wrote in the 20th century. And one of the things that was cool about her was that there weren't many female philosophers back then, and she was quite a trailblazer in that sense. But she thought a lot about the truth, and she wrote a lot about the truth, and she wrote a lot about political lying and the organized lying, and why how philosophers throughout history have treated this, and how we work as a society, in regards to the truth and lying. And I think that she wrote very many decades ahead of the internet and social media and disinformation and Donald Trump and fake news and all the things that we like to talk about now. But when you read her work, it's actually incredibly relevant. It's like she could predict what was going to happen. And some of the ideas that Hannah Arendt had was that people never anticipated the organized lying from a political class on a mass scale. People, when they used to lie in politics, would treat it as a very short-term thing. So I could say to you, no, I wasn't at that place, and I didn't say that thing that you're accusing me of. but ultimately I'd get exposed, and next week maybe someone will prove that that wasn't the case. But I'm telling a lie in the short term to get out of some accusation or get out of some problem. That kind of short-term opportunistic lying was really how most philosophers throughout human history had treated the issue. Whereas Hannah Arendt said they didn't anticipate that organized lying is about denying reality in the first place, and fooling people on a mass scale into a false reality over the long term. And that's what I think we've seen in the last few years on a really grand scale. That's what I think we've seen happen really easily with social media and how we get our information. And I just think it's fascinating that a philosopher who was writing 70 years ago could write so relevantly about a problem that she couldn't have predicted.
Yeah, I read her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, and this book about the Eichmann trial, which was really confronting as well, talking about mixed realities. Well, that's Hannah Arendt. Let's go to chapter 5. That's my main chapter, I think. Defeating disinformation. I think there's a big role for education. Am I right?
Yeah, over the long term, we have to be mostly focused on education. So there's two questions really, is if you want to defeat disinformation. The first is in the short term, there's some specific piece of information that you're trying to correct. And that's really difficult to do, but there's some promising research that shows how you can do that. And it's probably not in the ways that most people think. Most people think you need to myth bust, okay, here's a bunch of myths about a topic and here's all the ways to correct it. That's very problematic because you're normally repeating the myth. You make that more familiar. You might even have what they say is a little backfire where you actually are trying to correct something, but you make it more familiar. So this is the conversation around kind of short-term defeating disinformation. But the bigger issue is more long-term. And it's not just about disinformation. It's about acknowledging that we live in a world where we have radically changed the way that we receive information, the way we form opinions, the way we engage with each other, the way that we relate to each other, the way that we communicate issues, the way that we solve problems. All of these things have undergone a radical transformation in a very short period of time. So the long-term solutions are about how do we equip people with the skills to navigate this new world. And the skills we had that we used to teach students for the old world aren't very relevant and aren't very applicable to this new world. And I think a lot of parents understand this because parents these days straddle a generational divide where the parent grew up in a very different environment to the one that children are growing up in. And of course, I'm talking about social media.
Yeah.
So I think parents kind of understand that. They know that it's important to teach kids skills about social media, but they don't know how to do it because they didn't grow up with social media. They were never taught those skills. So we think about those things largely about cyberbullying and these sorts of new issues that parents deal with. But it's the same type of conversation. It's the same type of skills that we need to think about disinformation, because this is a brave new world, but we haven't caught up to it with the skills about how to teach our kids. Now, what are the types of skills? I think some people make the mistake when they think about teaching education curriculum about defeating disinformation. They see it as a very narrow problem where I can present you two headlines and I teach you the skills to pick which one is true and which one is false. That's important. That's an important skill, and that should be part of the curriculum. But that is a very narrow way to look at it. I think you need to look at it very broadly and think about civics education and citizenship and democracy, and what do those things mean. When you teach a kid about civics, you teach them how society works, how government works, what are the different institutions, and how does power work, where do laws come from, how do these change over time, what is the historical view, and how, what you're really teaching a kid is how to be a good citizen in a democracy, how to understand how it works in order for you to be able to vote correctly, as in using your brain, you know, not who to vote for, but pick issues that are important to you. Understand that the political parties will have a difference of policies, and you should vote for the one that aligns with your policies, and you should be skeptical of information. You should treat it you should assess it for bias and determine what's good information and what's bad information. So these are the types of skills that you need to teach to defeat disinformation. You are a person in a world, in a society that is largely digital and social media based, and there are consequences for the health of our democracy. And so here are the skills for you to be a good digital citizen, for you to understand how these technologies work, how they can be harmful, how to recognize when they might be used harmfully, what to do when you see them being used harmfully. So that's true for cyberbullying, how to intervene, and that's true for political disinformation. There's very similar skills, but broadly it's about changing our mindset for the education curriculum to see the role of that to be new skills for a new era, to breed healthy democratic citizens who can be participating in society.
Yeah, and I think how to respect someone else's opinion, because most of the time, what's been happening the last 2 years is myth busting, and that means when you say to someone, "You well, you didn't get vaccinated, you're wrong," or someone says you got vaccinated, you're in fact wrong. You're hurting people, and the way a message is conveyed to other people, that's massively going wrong in this country, especially in the Netherlands, and that's, I think, a skill, learning to see the perspective of other people and how to share your opinion with someone else without hurting the person and respecting his or her opinion. I think that's hugely important.
That's a really key skill, and that's something that maybe in 50 years ago we might have left that to parents to just teach as social etiquette. But that's so much more important now to be core curriculum that we need teachers and educators involved in, because you're exactly right. The way that society becomes when all we are is hostile to each other's opinions, and we don't do a good job of recognizing shared values and common ground. We kind of see that in America and a lot of other societies, and not just picking in America, where it becomes much more divided. That's a result of people not having the skills that you're talking about. So I think that we used to treat those kind of skills as, that's not part of the education curriculum, right? That's just being a nice person. But I think we need to view them much differently. It has to be part of the curriculum. And so, the pandemic has revealed this really, really deeply, that when you disagree with someone and your response is just to mock their opinion and to ridicule their opinion and to throw facts at them, then that is very counterproductive. It's not just ineffective, it's counterproductive. So what should you do? I mean, it's very hard, but this is a good example. Let's talk about the COVID vaccines. Now, I have very strongly held opinions about that, which I think are based in science and come from my concern for the well-being of others. I am pro-vaccine. Someone who is anti-vaccine feels exactly the same way. They feel like they are well-informed. It comes from a concern for others' health, and it's based on science that they have read. So how do we address this? How do we address this issue? Normally we focus on the differences. What we should do is focus on the things we have in common. I am concerned about the health of children. Therefore, I get them vaccinated. They are concerned about the health of children. Therefore, they don't get them vaccinated. So let's focus on our shared values, our shared concern for the health of children. Let's agree on that. Let's talk about that. Let's bond over that. And then we can build a relationship of trust where we can eventually get to the point where we can healthily discuss our difference of opinions on vaccinations. But we rush to the difference and we become hostile to each other, and we cut those people off and we force them into their bubbles, and we get forced into our own bubbles. And so the two sides never talk to each other, and that's very unhealthy.
Shared reality is a healthy ecosystem you talk about. That's the last chapter. You know, this morning I read a newspaper article about children reading less and less. They don't like books anymore. And the government is designing all these campaigns to get kids to read more books. But you know what I think? You can't stop this evolution, the internet evolution, the screen evolution. It's going to happen. Next year, kids are going to read less. They're not going to read paper books. You know what? We have the metaverse going on. And in a few years, these VR glasses and AR glasses are actually affordable. And I predict that in a few years, every student is wearing one of these devices, and they will spend more and more and more time in the metaverse. We want, as grown-ups, our kids to read books because it worked for us. But for them, it's irrelevant. And somehow we don't get to that reality. You talk about the shared reality. I'm really curious about your views about this new shared reality.
Well, yeah, a lot of the mistakes that we fall into, as you suggest, is trying to think that the answer to progress is to go backwards to some golden age of when we had it right, which is just human nature. That's what I'm comfortable with. I grew up in a certain set of circumstances. That's my comfort zone. I want to get back there. We can't do that, and it's not a good approach. And this example you mentioned around getting kids to read physical books is a good example. We are up against irresistible forces of change that we will not stop. Our role is to transition in a way that preserves the important things in society, the health of our society, the health of our democracy, the health of our young critical minds, in order to be able to be good digital citizens, you know, as we talked about earlier. How do we do that? We don't go backwards, we go forwards. And so the thing that has fractured that we really need to rediscover is a shared reality, as the title of that last section is called. So that doesn't mean we all think the same. That doesn't mean we don't have differences of opinion. That just means that we agree on what is real, and then we argue about our opinions. And so the way we do that is very complicated, and we don't do a very good job of it so far. We don't, and that section we looked at what can governments do, what can individuals do, what can the social media platforms do. There's all sorts of things. Everyone needs to play their part. But I think the first thing we all need to do is a bit of a change in perspective. We need to acknowledge that things have changed, and we need to acknowledge that we need different skills, and then we need to go about creating the curriculum for those skills and translating them. So one of the problems that I think is really interesting is people look at disinformation and they say old people are susceptible to disinformation because they grew up in a world without technology, and so they believe what they read. That's largely true. That's true. They have shown studies that older people are more susceptible to disinformation, but that's a very simplistic view. We've got to recognize that young people have a different problem, and I'm sure you've experienced this time with your students very often. They grew up in a world where everyone was a content creator. And so whereas old people grew up in a world where if you read something, you could believe it, young people grow up in a world where if you read something or see something, you don't believe it because your friend could have made it on their phone in 5 minutes. And so what if the New York Times is writing an article or making a video, or the BBC's making a video? Your friend can do that. You can do that. You don't even need a computer. You could do it on your VR headset. So what is the consequence of that? Young people, it's not that they mistrust information that they shouldn't trust. It's that I think they have a very low level of trust in any information. So we've got to make sure that that is a healthy skepticism. So to kind of bring this conversation full circle, you asked me at the start, what I studied and how my education was. I think the most useful thing that I studied was high school history. And I loved history in high school, and I studied as much of it as I could, ancient history and modern history. I couldn't get enough of it. And when we were taught history in high school, they taught us that these ancient sources were pretty dodgy. So how do you read that information and decide what is good and what is true and what is useful? Well, there's all sorts of tools you can use. You look at who the author is. Are they biased? Do they have an ulterior motive? What is the historical context? What do the other sources say? Is this source contemporaneous with what they're writing about? There's all sorts of skills that people can have learnt as students that are useful for evaluating ancient history sources. Now, those are the sorts of skills that we need to give to students to address disinformation. Look at information as if it could be good or bad, but it's probably somewhere in between, and we need the skills to evaluate what we can use it for. Is it biased? Who is the author? What do other sources say? What is the context around this? What is the motive of the person who's writing this? Those are the types of things that you need to look at information in the social media age and determine for yourself. So I think that is where you need to take the focus in terms of education. And the good news is we have those skills, we teach those skills. We've just never thought about applying it to our current age, just ancient history.
You refer to a lot of books in your book. If we want to do some further reading about this topic, I think there's a book called Misinformation you refer to in your book. What if people want to know more about this topic? Maybe educators who want to learn how to teach in this subject. Where would you refer them to?
I think there's a lot. This is a really fast-moving area, and there's a lot of really good resources being developed every day. I think that there's a couple of specific sources that are really good for educators. I can email them to you, and maybe you can put them in a description or make them available online. And that's a really good place to start. And I think this is a really growing area of knowledge that hopefully we start to see some education systems develop a curriculum that can be replicated, in other places and other education systems as well.
Facts and Other Lies. It was a very pleasant and informational read. So thanks for writing the book. I'm going to share our interview with my readers here. I'm going to send you a copy because I think you captured the idea of the book perfectly here. So I think it's a good source of information for other people who would like to know more about your book. I'd like to end by thanking you, Ed. Thanks for your time. You were really generous.
Thanks, Simon.
And I'm going back to teaching right now in a few minutes. So thanks.
Well, good luck. Thank you for having me on. I thought it was a great chat. And I hope that you can help solve this problem about deciding how to teach the next generation these sorts of skills.
I'm going to do the best I can. Enjoy the rest of the day, Ed.
Thank you.